Hello viewers, and a warm welcome to the show this evening. I am your host, Chef Andy, and I'm of course joined by a very, very beautiful guest, one that you may have already seen on the show before. But before I proceed, I will of course give her this opportunity to introduce herself.
Hi viewers, my name is Doris Rebecca, I prefer Becky, and you've already seen me on the show, and I'm glad to be back and welcome.
Now, Becky is of course a HR by profession, a food lover, and of course someone who's very, very passionate about cooking. So on this particular episode, I'm pretty much hoping to convince her that this particular recipe maybe should be something that she may definitely want to try. Now, before I proceed, I will of course introduce the ingredients just to give you an idea of what to expect for this show. Now, from the very front, I've got some mixed spices. I've also got some dried oregano, a bit of some unsalted butter. I've also got about 6 or 7 pieces of garlic cloves, a bit of some fresh thyme, springs of course. I've also got about a quarter cup of some grated Parmesan cheese and about half a cup of some cheddar cheese. I'm also going to be using 2 medium-sized white onions, about 1 cup of some whipping cream, some salt and some black peppercorns which I'll be using for seasoning. And last but not least, about 4 large potatoes which are already peeled and washed. Now, before we begin, I will of course introduce the dish for today, which is a very, very simple classic potato gratin. And of course, we are going to be starting off this very, very shortly. But before we do so, we'll of course give you this chance to sit back, relax and unwind, and we'll catch you after a short break. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. If you're just tuning in, we've pretty much introduced the dish for today, which is a very, very simple classic potato gratin. We are of course going to add some simple tricks and tips around it, which of course meaning we are going to be making it a little spicy, and we're of course going to be incorporating a little bit more ingredients than what you'd expect in your plain old potato gratin. I will also mention the guest on the show today. Her name is Becky. For some of you who've seen her on the show before, she is a HR and a very, very big food lover. And I'm hoping to convince her to actually take this potato dish home and try it on her own, right?
Yes.
Perfect. Now, before we begin, very important that I mention some of the key items that you will require in this recipe. First and foremost, you will require the aid of an oven. Remember, we are of course going to be cooking the mixture in the oven a little later on. You will of course also need a very, very small saucepan just to aid you in heating up your cream, and of course just to bring the cream up to room temperature or just above room temperature before we proceed to assemble everything else and begin to bake. Something also very, very handy to have, you will of course require any particular oven-proof dish that you may actually have available to you. So it doesn't really matter if it's stainless steel, glass or ceramic. You will actually be using this quite as a very handy tool, especially in baking this very simple dish, being the fact that you will of course be broiling it, which means you will be cooking it in the oven with the ingredients submerged in some liquid. You will also require a bit of butter, which you'll be using to basically line your dish, just to make sure that you don't have all your ingredients sticking to the sides. Another last and final item that is very, very crucial for this, you will also require some aluminium foil. This is of course just to aid in rushing the process of broiling the potatoes. And then we'll of course take this out somewhere between the cooking process, and we will proceed to gratinate our cheese just before proceeding to serve. But before we begin, I'll of course grab the saucepan before us, and we're just basically going to throw in some of the ingredients which will begin to heat up in a very small amount of heat, giving us time to begin to slice our potatoes. Now you can proceed to add that, switch that on. And now to your saucepan, begin by adding your cream. And once that's done, I'm pretty much going to add about 3 cloves of garlic, but very simply, I'll begin by slicing them into half. And this is basically to allow just a bit of infusion of the garlic aromas into the cream, making of course sure that it's going to give it a nice, beautiful garlicky freshness once we're done heating this through. Right, so this can go onto the heat. Very important to also mention, be very vigilant when preheating your cream for 2 reasons. It can actually split if it's overheated, and it can actually reduce, making it very impossible for you to be able to layer inside your dish before baking. So be sure to always keep your temperature at its lowest possible level, just to make sure that you don't actually proceed to overcook or over reduce your cream. And now next up, as we allow that to heat up, very simply we'll begin to chop up some of the ingredients that will incorporate to this. So I'm going to start with some white onion. So begin by slicing those into half. And now all we need to do is now slice those into some half moon shapes. So proceed to chop that very finely or very thin with a sharp knife. And to the last and final piece. Simple. Right. Now basically the idea is to keep your onions nice and thin. Remember, you do want them to soften very gently as you cook this in the oven. So be sure to make sure to use a sharp knife and get them as thin as you possibly can. This will of course also aid in making sure that they can actually disappear very nicely into your gratin. And of course, the one thing that you're definitely looking for is that beautiful appearance and texture of the onions. So by having them in this sizable chunk, we'll of course make sure that you also have a nice, beautiful layering of your gratin right through to the top. Right, now once that's done, proceed to set your onions aside in a bowl. Right, now next thing we're going to do is we're going to slice our potatoes. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be working with gratin. So very importantly, begin first by draining your potatoes completely. And you can actually allow those to sit in a bowl right next to you. And a beautiful thing that this does is actually allows for your potatoes to drain very quickly. And another thing you also want to do is make sure that you reduce as much water as you can so that it doesn't actually mix with the cream and split. Another thing you should be able to remember to do a little earlier is heat up your oven. Remember, this has to go right from assembly straight into the oven. So we're going to just turn that on and allow that to preheat. I'm going to set it at about 200 and we'll give it just a bit of time to heat up. Now next, very simply, we're going to slice our potatoes. Now you can be able to slice your potatoes very easily using a mandolin. I think you've seen a mandolin before, yeah?
Yes.
I don't have one in studios today, but I will of course show you a very simple technique of slicing by hand. Of course, for most viewers at home, you may not of course have some of the tools we use on the show, but by using a sharp knife, you can of course be able to get the same particular texture. So the idea here is to basically have your potato nice and thin. So what I like to do is basically begin by looking at the potato first of all, turn it around and find the most levelest part of the potato. And what I do is I basically maybe slice from one of the sides. So basically just slice a little wedge off the sides like that. And what this does, it actually enables for your potato to be much easier to slice, in that you can actually be able to slice it without it tippling left and right. And we're just going to discard that. So next thing we're going to do is begin by slicing from the very end. Take out a bit of the wedge from the side. Of course, very, very importantly, don't slice a very, very thick one from the edges, because you're also trying to avoid wasting your potato through the process. And all you need to do now is, using your sharp knife, proceed to slice some very, very thin wafer slices of your potato. Of course, taking your time to do so very slowly also aids in making sure that you get your slices nice and even. So proceed to slice right through, repeating the process to the very, very end. Okay, so our cream is now heated up, so you can now turn that off completely. Perfect. Right, so basically we're going to allow the cream to cool down slightly. And while we do so, we're going to add a small sprig of some thyme. This is basically to allow the cream to start absorbing the aromas from the thyme and basically allow for the first process of infusion. And as Becky does so, I'm just going to proceed to finish off slicing the rest of our potato. Of course, you're looking at just about 3 large potatoes should be able to fill up a small dish such as this one. You can of course make a bigger portion, which will of course mean maybe altering the details on the recipe, which will of course maybe call for a little more potatoes. And now, while we allow that to cool off, I'm going to allow for you to basically run a bit of butter inside our dish. Remember, the butter is very, very essential in the fact that it actually allows for us to make sure that it doesn't stick to the sides, and it's also very, very easy to lift once it's cooked. Then once more, begin by slicing off a very thin slice of your potato from one end and proceed to slice that right through, making sure to keep the thickness very, very even as you proceed. And this of course brings me to ask you, Becky, maybe I haven't asked this already in the show, but what are maybe some of the most embarrassing moments you've had in the kitchen?
Oh wow, some of the most embarrassing.
Yes, or something funny that you may have experienced in the kitchen as a cook or as a food lover.
Many people might not believe this, but I actually learned how to make ugali.
When?
This year,
Are you
January.
serious? And who's been making ugali before?
My mom.
So now you pretty much now have mastered the technique of
Yeah.
making a simple ugali.
Totally.
But you're an ugali fan, right?
Yeah.
Which of course means you've been using your mom for a very, very long time.
Very long time.
That's a good thing. Anything else? Maybe
The first
experiences
time
in
I
cooking.
cooked cabbage,
Uh-huh.
the whole house was on fire.
Everything caught fire.
Yes.
Well, that of course has happened to me as well. I've actually had an instance when I was training as a chef. What I did is I put a few ingredients in the oven and I decided to go on break.
Wow.
So basically what happened is, at the moment I remember that I had something in the oven, it was of course too late.
Wow.
And what happened is, on my way as I was rushing back to the kitchen to turn the oven off, I bumped into someone that was a very, very close friend. And what we ended up doing is, instead of me going straight to the kitchen to turn the oven off, I actually went past the kitchen telling stories. And by the time I came back, there was actually fire. There was a bit of a fire outside. There was a bit of smoke, and we literally had to redo that kitchen from scratch. So it's one particular lesson that I learned over the period of time as a chef as well. That is also, it's very, very important, of course, to make sure that if you're going to be cooking anything in the oven, be sure to maybe select an oven that maybe has an auto timer, such as the one we're using on the set today. And the auto timer option is a very handy one, because what happens is, as soon as the timer goes all the way to 0, it actually switches off the oven completely. Now what happens is, with some of you who are maybe using the old-fashioned ovens that don't really come with an automatic timer on them, remember, as soon as you turn those on, it will continue cooking until you actually turn it off. So very, very important lesson that I learned, and from ever since then I've actually stuck myself to working with ovens with timers. So it does actually happen that you may see fires every now and then. Right, so just to come back to our dish, we basically sliced our potatoes. So we are pretty much going to start layering our ingredients into our dish. So we're going to start very, very simply by splitting the onion rings or the onion slices, making sure, of course, to split them up, making it much easier for you to layer them right through the dish as you assemble. And now all you're going to do now is proceed to layer everything together, but very important that you have your seasoning close to you. So I'm going to have you be close to the salt and pepper. And all we are going to do now is we're going to start to assemble this in very, very thin layers. So you're going to begin the process by layering, or rather setting one layer of your thinly sliced potatoes, making, of course, sure that they all touch the sides of your dish. And then what you're going to add to that is your onions. So sprinkle those in a very, very thin layer. Of course, then it's also important to mention, remember the same quantity every time you place into the layer. So if you're going to use 2 handfuls, make sure it sticks the same way right to the end. And all we are going to do now is proceed to season. So you can add some salt and some black pepper. And what happens is, in many cases, some of us may also forget to season the mixture. So I always recommend, it is of course very vital that you remember to season as you assemble your layers into your baking dish, because this will of course make sure that each layer is evenly seasoned and that the flavor carries through right from the bottom all the way to the top layer. Right, then I'm also going to hand you some of the oregano and some of the mixed spices. So what you're going to do is you're also going to sprinkle a bit of each. And then we're just basically going to repeat the same process right up until we get to the very top. And you can be very generous with the seasoning.
Okay.
Remember, you actually want the potatoes to absorb all this flavor, and the fact that you're using cream, what happens is cream is a very, very bland ingredient, and what happens is the seasoning may not come through. So very important to also mention to you at home, be sure to give a nice generous seasoning right through the layers. Remember, your cream is of course very, very bland in flavor. So the spices that you actually set on each layer is basically what's going to carry out or carry forward the flavor right to the very point that you serve your dish. Right, then once more we'll begin the same process, placing about 6 pieces on each layer. Then repeat the process once more by adding your onions. Right, and then we repeat the same process once more. So it's actually a very, very simple technique of making potatoes.
Yeah.
And it's also very, very handy in that. And another thing I should also mention, you notice the pattern that we overlaid the potatoes one over the other?
Yes.
So the spaces that you leave in there are basically to allow for the cream to go right through the spaces, and that it'll actually be able to cook right through each layer. And one thing that most people may of course forget at times, if you go ahead and grab maybe 2 slices of your potatoes and set them together like this, what will happen is your cream will not be able to get through to each layer, and what will happen is you're going to have stacks of very, very tightly packed potatoes, and you'll actually have your cream either going all the way to the bottom and the potatoes coming up, or you'll have all your cream go to the top and your potatoes sink to the bottom. Right? So now we're going to repeat the same process. So it's a very, very easy technique to remember, yeah? Right. Then I'm going to have one right in the center like that. Now what happens is this is basically going to put a bit of weight in the center. So what happens is as the cream continues to cook, it will actually raise from the sides and the center will actually sink down, just to make sure that we get an even layer.
Okay.
And then of course, just to finish that off, another very, very thin layer of some chopped shallots or white onions. Right, and we can repeat the same process of seasoning. And of course, at this time, by the time you're done setting each layer one after the other, it will of course also give you quite a bit of time to allow for your cream to cool off completely. So I'm going to now, once I'm done seasoning, we're pretty much going to pour the cream in there, and you can now proceed to hold on to your aluminum foil. But another pointer I will also share with you, very important to remember to also grease your aluminum. Remember, it could actually stick to the potatoes as it continues to cook, and it may of course make it a little harder to remove. So very simply, by of course turning over your foil, making sure to use the less glossier side, proceed to grab a bit of butter. And all you're going to do is run the butter right over the inside section of your aluminum. That's pretty much going to cover over your dish. Making sure to give a nice generous coating. This of course is also going to make sure that your aluminum does not stick to the sides of the dish, and it will of course lift off very, very simply once it's time to remove it as it comes out of the oven. Right, so once more a bit of potatoes over the top. Of course, taking time to fill up any particular spaces from the sides. Right, simple as that. And now once that is done, we're pretty much going to add another layer of seasoning just on its own without the onions. Remember another thing as well, we don't actually have onions over the top, because what happens is they're going to become very, very brown, and it's also going to conflict with the flavors of the cheeses. So that's why we actually make sure that the onions are completely buried underneath, and we only have potato right at the top. Right, so then once you're done, proceed to just finish off the rest of your seasoning by sprinkling that right over the top. Season once more with some salt. And lastly, some black peppercorns. Nice and easy. Now all you're going to do at this stage is you're going to wiggle your pot around a little bit just to make sure you can actually get the cream to literally come off the sides of your pot. And remember, cream is not something you want to add directly over the top, because it is going to leave a bit of a mess. So be sure to always first of all skim off any bit of cream that you may have over the top, and make sure not to add this to your dish. And then once done, all you need to do is pour your mixture from the very center and just allow for the cream to pretty much spread out into your dish on its own.
Chef, and if I may ask, do you have to use cream, or you can use milk?
You can of course use milk as well. It's also going to do quite a very, very similar thing to the cream. But what happens is milk of course contains less butter fat to cream. So what happens is with milk, it will of course heat up too quickly. And what happens is, because the potatoes are going to ooze out a bit of liquid, the milk and the juices from the potatoes will actually split. But the beautiful thing about using cream is actually much heavier, and it's actually more resilient to splitting up, especially when it comes into contact with the potatoes. So what happens is cream will be able to hold on to, cream will basically cook much better than what milk would do. Milk will also evaporate a little faster. So what will happen is, if you're working with milk, you'll maybe pretty much have to add quite a little more milk right over the surface of the potatoes. And what happens is, because it's going to evaporate very quickly, you may have to use more milk. Now the beautiful thing about cream is, once you have your layer in there, it's actually going to be able to swell, and remember, as it continues to cook, it's also going to continue to swell up. And basically what happens is, because of the butterfat content in the cream, it's actually going to also make your potatoes nice and rich. So the only difference is that if you're going to work with milk, you may have to use more as compared to cream. but it is also a very cost-effective technique that you can work with. So if you're going to be using milk, it will of course cost you more in the quantity process, but with cream you're going to use much less. Any other question?
No.
Nothing? Perfect. Right, so once this is done, all you need to do now is proceed to finish this off. I'm just going to quickly rinse my hands. So very simply, before you continue to cover up your dish, very simple technique that is very handy to remember as well. Always remember to press down the mixture. This is of course to make sure that you can actually get as much air out of the mixture, and also you can actually have the cream come almost to the surface. You can also just maybe tilt your bowl sideways, and this can actually aid you in helping for the cream to run to one end. And then you can pretty much just keep repeating the process as you press down. And what happens is every time you tilt it, it's basically going to go sliding into each layer, and you'll basically be able to make sure that the cream goes all the way to the bottom. So that's also another tip that I can share. When you use a clear kind of a bowl, you can actually be able to see right through to the bottom, as opposed to maybe the ceramic one that you may actually not be able to. Right, so pressing down into your potatoes, proceed to just work your spoon around. Of course, also making sure that the cream does touch the surface at the top of your potatoes. Right, so as you can see, 1 cup of cream will actually make it very possible for you to come maybe as much as about 3/4 of your baking dish. And remember, if you're going to use a bigger dish, just remember to change the quantity of the cream, because then again a bigger dish may actually require more cream. Right, so once that is done, all we need to do now is you can proceed to cover this. But one thing I've actually learned over the period of making a gratin, a very handy addition you can always use as well, is by putting some knobs of butter over the top. This is actually going to make the dish very nice and rich, and it's also going to make sure that as the cream comes to the surface, it's not also going to form a very hard crust. The butter will actually keep the potatoes nice and moist at the top, just before we proceed to add the cheese. Right, so once that's in, so basically all you need to do now is make sure that the part that actually has the grease is the one that comes right over the top. Perfect. Right, so once that's done, just always begin by pressing the sides first, just to make sure that you're actually able to seal all the sides. And then now you can start to tuck in from the edges, and mostly maybe at the ends. That's normally where you can actually be able to open it much easier. So always begin by tucking at the ends. And then the last and final step before it goes into the oven, remember, once this goes into the oven, it is also going to produce a bit of steam because it's expanding. So very important, remember to slice a very small hole over the top, and this is basically to allow the steam to escape and air to escape. Right, so once this is done, we're pretty much now going to move this into the oven. We are of course going to take it out somewhere between about the 30th and the 40th minute, which will of course also give us a chance to just proceed to add our cheese. Then we'll proceed to remove the aluminium and allow the cheese to gratinate, taking us to the last and final part of plating. But for now, we're going to allow that to cook in the oven for anywhere between 30 to 35 minutes. And by the time this comes out, be sure to check with a fork or a sharp knife that each of the potato slices are actually nice and tender and they're actually cooked through. Right, so I'm just going to grab that, and I'll ask you to do us the favor of sliding that in. So let me just pull that out slightly. Then push it to the very back end. Perfect. Right, so very important to always share the tip with you, especially when working with gratin. Remember, this requires the very most hottest point of your oven. So always my preference, or rather, is always to work with the centermost part of the oven, but be sure to push your dish all the way to the back because it is much hotter at the back and you'll actually get a beautiful concentration of heat. And that of course takes us to our next break, which will of course give us a bit of time to allow the potatoes to cook through. But please don't touch that dial. You do of course don't want to miss out on what we're going to be doing next. And of course we will also take that out very, very briefly after the break just to show you what it looks like. And I'm also going to take you through the very, very simple process of spreading out your cheese and gratinating to finish. So please don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. If you're just tuning in or you just got the chance to tune into the show, we've pretty much started the first cooking process of the potato, the classic potato gratin. So we're basically going to take it out very, very briefly, and we'll finish it off by adding some cheese on top. Then we will return it back to the oven, allow it to gratinate very, very briefly, and then we will proceed to plate. So I'm going to begin by taking this out. Now, as mentioned, it has been cooking for about half an hour with the foil on, of course. But we are, of course, now going to take the foil off completely. And as you can see now, it's actually started to cook off. You can see the potatoes are almost very, very soggy now.
Yeah.
Right, so pretty much all you need to do at this stage is proceed to add your cheese. So I'm just going to quickly crumble it in the bowl and proceed to sprinkle that over, making sure of course to give a nice beautiful layer. And this process will of course give it also a bit of time for the liquid to completely evaporate from the base of the dish, giving us a nice well set gratin at the end of the process. So in goes your cheddar cheese. Finish off by adding your Parmesan cheese. You can of course also mix it in one bowl and then proceed to add that over the top. Right, once you've got a nice even coating over the top, all you need to do now is switch your element to the top element. So pretty much this is basically just going to brown the top of the dish. And this would give you maybe about 10 to 20 minutes, or rather 10 to 15 minutes on the highest end. Of course, keeping it at a very, very modest heat just to make sure that you don't actually overcook the top, leaving a very, very dry and overcooked crust. So once done, proceed to put back in the oven once more. And remember, very, very importantly, always try and get the most levelest point of your oven. But for this particular process that you will be gratinating, make sure that you only have the top element running. And this is basically just to give it a bit of the color and of course to melt the cheese. So I'm going to turn up my heat to about 200. And we're going to set that for about 10 minutes and we'll give that a few minutes to gratinate, giving us another moment to take a very, very quick break. But when we do come back, I will of course show you what the complete dish looks like, and I'm also going to give you some very, very simple serving suggestions. So please don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. Hello viewers, and welcome back yet again. For those of you who've been tuning in this far, and for those of you who may have missed out, we're right at the last and final part of the dish. So I'm going to begin to take it out of the oven before we proceed. Thank you. And we're just going to set that on the counter. I'm also going to move it onto a board and we can clear the tray. Now, as mentioned, the gratin is complete now. And as we mentioned a little earlier, about 30 minutes of cooking and an extra about 4 to 5 minutes of the gratination process. And at the moment, if we can check the crust, you can actually be able to hear it's actually nice and crusty. So this is basically the last and final stage of making your gratin. It's a very, very simple technique. And all that's left to do now is pretty much to plate it. So I'm going to begin by slicing it right across. Of course, always making sure that your knife goes right through. And work your knife right around the sides of your baking tray or baking dish, just to make sure it's also detached from the sides. And all you're left to do now is lift that from the dish and onto your plate. So this will nice and simply lift from the dish. Of course, it will be much harder to take that out of its container, of course, if it's not really cooked through. But as you can be able to see, a nice beautiful layering. And you can actually tell that it's nicely set if you can be able to see that it's moist right through and you don't have any dry patches in between. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the last and final part of our gratin. As mentioned, very, very beautiful accompaniment to any meat, chicken, fish, or even vegetarian dish. You can, of course, be able to serve it on its own, maybe with a bit of a salad, and of course, any particular sauce that you may prefer. Another thing also to mention, remember there's a vast amount of cheeses that are available to us here in the city. So do take a chance of maybe trying out some different cheeses. Of course, all the beautiful cheeses have very, very different textures and tastes. So you can, of course, be able to try and taste the cheeses on purchase. Maybe try it out at the vendors that you're going to purchase your cheese from. And you can actually be able to tell what cheese works for you. So now we're, of course, going to bid you farewell at this stage, bidding you farewell and reminding you that you can, of course, just like our guest today, you can, of course, be able to join us on the show as well by actually sending a message on the 5-digit number that's on the screens. Just send us a message through that code and be able proceed to tell us why you'd like to be on the show, what you're looking at learning from the show, and maybe some of your interests. And maybe one of you could also be very, very lucky to join me here at the studios and try out one of your very own favorite meals. But for now, we are going to bid you farewell, reminding you to check out our Facebook page. Do leave your comments, queries, or any particular suggestions. And of course, you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, that's BrandPlus TV Kenya, where you can recap on this and many more beautiful dishes. But for now, do have a lovely evening, be blessed, and until the next episode, see you soon.